the year 1575 since the Nativity of Christ. The vast plains of Eastern Europe were shackled by a fierce frost. The winter that year was particularly harsh, as if nature itself reflected the cold and turmoil that reigned in the hearts of men. Over the enormous Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, loomed a shadow, and its name was the Interregnum. The throne, so recently occupied by Henry of Valois, was vacant. The young French prince, elected king, had fled his new country like a thief in the night upon hearing of his brother's death and the possibility of inheriting the French crown. He left behind not just a power vacuum. He left a fractured, passion-seething country, where every powerful magnate already saw himself as the arbiter of fate, and millions of proud, armed nobles were ready to draw their sabers to defend their chosen candidate. This was an era when the very concept of the state became fragile. In the absence of a king, laws were weak, courts were inactive, and robber bands, often consisting of nobles who decided their saber was the supreme law, roamed the roads. The air was electrified with anticipation. In taverns and palaces, in manors and marketplaces, people whispered, argued, formed secret alliances, and hatched plots. The great powers, like vultures, circled over the weakened giant. The mighty Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II of Habsburg was already extending his hand towards the Polish crown, promising gold and order. From the east, from his snow-covered Moscow, drenched in the blood of the Oprichnina, Tsar Ivan Vasilievich, known as the Terrible, eyed the Polish throne with predatory interest. His name evoked a mixture of terror and revulsion in Poles and Lithuanians, but his ambassadors brought with them untold riches and promises to crush the eternal enemy, the Ottoman Empire. It seemed the choice was only between two titans, the Austrian eagle and the Russian bear, between German order and Muscovite despotism. The Commonwealth stood on the brink of an abyss, ready either to fall into the arms of one of its powerful neighbors, or to explode from within in the flames of civil war. And at this very moment, when all the main pieces on the political chessboard seemed to be set, from the misty blood and legend-shrouded mountains of Transylvania, from a half-forgotten periphery of the Christian world, a name was heard that few took seriously. The name of a man considered a vassal of the Turkish Sultan, the ruler of a wild, semi-pagan principality. A name destined to thunder throughout Europe, to become synonymous with iron will, military genius, and state-building. This was the name Stefan Batory, or as the whole world would soon remember him, Stephen Báthory. No one yet knew that this 42-year-old Hungarian, hardened in battles and political intrigues, would become not just a king. He would become the hammer that would forge a new Polish army, and the sword that would deliver a crushing blow to the growing power of the Muscovite Tsardom, forever changing the balance of power in Eastern Europe. This is the story of how a foreigner, an outsider, managed to ascend one of the most prestigious and at the same time most unstable thrones in Europe, and in 10 years of his reign inscribe his name in history in golden letters. This is the story of the great King Stephen Báthory. Before we see our hero burst into major European politics, we must journey to the land that nurtured him. To Transylvania, a land of dense forests, high Carpathian mountains, and grim fortresses. A land where, for centuries, the destinies of Hungarians, Romanians, and Germans intertwined. A land that became a bloody frontier between three worlds: the Catholic West, represented by the Habsburg Empire, the Orthodox East, and the advancing Islamic crescent of the Ottoman Empire from the south. It was in this seething cauldron of peoples, religions, and ambitions that in the year 1533, in the castle of Szymlew-Szylvaniye, Stefan Batory was born. The Báthory family was one of the most ancient and influential in the Kingdom of Hungary. Their lineage, according to legend, traced back to one of the chieftains who came with Arpad to Pannonia. Their coat of arms, 3 wolf's fangs, was known throughout the country. But this fame was ambiguous. The Báthory clan gave Hungary voivodes, judges, and bishops. But it also produced monsters whose names were whispered by the fireside on cold nights. On the one hand, they were pillars of Hungarian statehood. On the other, they were considered carriers of a certain wild, untamable energy, a wolf's blood, which could lead to either great achievements or monstrous crimes. Very soon after Stephen's death, his niece Elizabeth Báthory would go down in history as the Blood Countess, one of the most brutal serial killers in human history. Was it a family curse, some dark streak running through generations? Or was it simply an extreme degree of the cruelty and unbridled passion inherent in many aristocrats of that era? Whatever the case, Stephen inherited from his ancestors not a mythical cruelty, but something more valuable: an unbending will, a sharp mind, and the natural instincts of a predator. His childhood and youth coincided with a tragic period for Hungary. In 1526, 7 years before his birth, at the Battle of Mohács, the Hungarian knightly army was almost completely annihilated by the army of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. King Louis II drowned while fleeing. Great Hungary, once one of the strongest powers in Central Europe, ceased to exist. Its territory was divided into 3 parts. The western and northern parts went to the Austrian Habsburgs. The central part, including the capital Buda, became an Ottoman pashalik, and only in the east, in Transylvania, a fragment of Hungarian statehood remained, a vassal principality forced to maneuver between the 2 giants. It was in this atmosphere of constant threat, humiliating vassalage, and desperate struggle for survival that young Istvan grew up. He did not receive a systematic classical education like many European princes. His universities were battles and halls for diplomatic negotiations. His childhood toys were not wooden horses, but real bows and sabers. Instead of studying the works of Aristotle, he learned to read tracks on a forest path, to distinguish the size of an enemy detachment by the smoke of its campfire, and to understand the psychology of mercenary soldiers. From a young age, he saw that brute force far from decided everything. Far more important was the ability to wait, to be cunning, to find the enemy's weaknesses, to set enemies against each other. He mastered Latin, the international language of diplomacy at the time, and spoke German and Italian. But his main language was the language of power. In his youth, he leaned towards the Habsburgs. This was natural. The Austrian emperor was a Christian monarch, a symbol of the struggle against the Ottoman threat. Báthory spent several years at the court of Emperor Ferdinand of Mons in Vienna. He saw the splendor and power of the Habsburg Empire, but he also saw its unwieldiness, its bureaucracy, its arrogance towards Hungarians. This experience became a crucial lesson for him. He understood that for the Habsburgs, Hungary was just a buffer zone, a bargaining chip in their global game. The salvation of Hungary was a matter for the Hungarians themselves. The turning point in his life came in the year 1556. At that time, the Transylvanian throne was taken by John II Sigismund Zapolya, the son of the last national king of Hungary. Báthory joined him, becoming one of his closest associates and the commander of his army. Now he fought against the Habsburgs, trying to win back Hungarian lands from them. During a diplomatic mission to Vienna in 1565, he was treacherously arrested by order of Emperor Maximilian II, the very same man who, 10 years later, would become his main rival for the Polish throne. Báthory spent 2 years in confinement. This was not a time of despair, but of rethinking. Far from the hustle and intrigues in the silence of his prison cell, he read a great deal. His favorite book became Gaius Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War. He did not just read it, he studied it, making notes in the margins, analyzing every maneuver, every political decision. He saw in Caesar not just a commander, but an ideal ruler, a man who combined military genius with political foresight, the ability to speak to legions and the Senate in their own language. In prison, Báthory understood that war is not just a clash of armies. It is a continuation of politics, and victory is forged not only on the battlefield but also in the minds of people, in the treasury, and in the chancellery. He emerged from prison a different man, even more calculating, purposeful, and firm in his convictions. In 1571, John II Sigismund died without leaving an heir. The Transylvanian nobility gathered at a diet, unanimously elected the 40-year-old Stefan Batory as their prince. This was not a choice by right of blood. It was a recognition of his merits, his intelligence, and his will. In accepting power, Báthory also accepted a heavy legacy: vassal dependence on the Ottoman Empire. Every year he had to send tribute to Istanbul, 10,000 ducats. The Sultan's ambassadors behaved in his capital of Gülafehérvár, which we know today as Alba Iulia, as if they were the masters. It was humiliating, but Báthory understood. An open confrontation with the Ottomans would be suicide for Little Transylvania. He paid the tribute, smiled at the ambassadors, but at the same time strengthened his army, built fortresses, and waited for his moment. He learned to wear the mask of a submissive vassal, hiding beneath it the steel resolve of a sovereign ruler. It was this experience, the experience of governing a state on the fault line of civilizations, that made him the ideal candidate for another, much larger and no less complex state, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He did not know it yet, but fate was already preparing a new, dizzying turn for him. While Stephen Báthory was consolidating his power in Transylvania, hundreds of kilometers to the north, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a drama of truly epic proportions was unfolding. The first interregnum after the flight of Henry of Valois in 1574 became a severe test of the noble republic's resilience. The state, where the king was not an absolute monarch but the first among equals elected by the aristocracy, found itself in a situation where its very existence was threatened. Imagine this picture. A huge country, a federation of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, without a central authority. Every magnate, owner of dozens of towns and thousands of villages, became an uncrowned king in his own lands. Their private armies, sometimes numbering thousands of soldiers, were ready for battle. The parliament of the nobility, was torn by contradictions. The senators, representing the top of the aristocracy and the clergy, leaned towards the candidacy of Emperor Maximilian of Habsburg. They saw him as a guarantor of stability and order, capable of curbing the willfulness of the lesser nobility. Maximilian was rich, influential, and supported by the Pope. It seemed his election was a done deal. But there was another force. Tens of thousands of ordinary nobles, proud of their golden liberty, were terrified of the strengthening of royal power and German dominance. They saw the Habsburg as a threat to their privileges, a threat of turning an elective monarchy into a hereditary one. Their sympathies were with a Piast candidate, that is, a Polish king. But there was no worthy candidate among their own. And then the most exotic and frightening alternative arose, the Muscovite Tsar Ivan the Terrible. His candidacy was a nightmare for the Catholic clergy and patriots who remembered his atrocities in Livonia. But Ivan had his supporters, especially in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. They hoped that by becoming king of the Commonwealth, the Terrible would cease his devastating raids, and the combined forces of the two states could finally crush the Crimean Khanate and the Ottoman Empire. Ivan's ambassadors were not stingy with promises. He offered unheard-of sums of money, a military alliance, and vast territories. It was a diabolical temptation. It was at this moment that a man appeared on the scene who was destined to become the gray eminence of these elections and the future king's closest associate. His name was Jan Zamoyski. He was not a high-born magnate but came from the middle nobility, having made a dizzying career thanks to his intelligence, education, and energy. He had studied at the University of Padua in Italy, which was then a center of European political thought. Zamoyski absorbed the ideas of republicanism, read Machiavelli and ancient Roman authors, and returned to his homeland a convinced supporter of a strong state. He was the embodiment of the Renaissance ideal, a politician, scholar, orator, and future commander. Zamoyski was a brilliant speaker, a subtle politician, and an ardent patriot. He understood that both the Habsburg and the Terrible were a mortal threat to the independence of the Commonwealth. He needed a third candidate, someone who was not tied to the great powers, who would be a strong leader but who would also respect the nobles' liberties. And his gaze turned south towards Transylvania. Stephen Báthory's candidacy at first seemed absurd. Some Hungarian, a vassal of the Sultan or ruler of a backwater, his opponents hissed. But Zamoyski saw in Báthory what others did not. He saw a hardened warrior, not an effete courtier. He saw an experienced ruler, not a theorist. He saw a man who had learned firsthand what it meant to fight for independence against powerful neighbors. Moreover, Báthory was a Catholic, which reassured the clergy, but he was also known for his religious tolerance, which was critically important for the multi-confessional Commonwealth, where Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and Protestants lived side by side. Zamoyski and his supporters launched a vigorous campaign. They painted a picture of Báthory as the ideal Night King, a defender of Christianity who would restore the country's former glory. Their main argument was, "It is better to choose a worthy foreigner than an unworthy compatriot or a powerful neighbor who will swallow us." The climax came in December 1575 at the election Sejm on the field of Wola near Warsaw. It was an incredible spectacle. Tens of thousands of nobles from all over the country pitched their tents here, arriving with weapons and servants. The field turned into a huge military camp, divided into factions. The air buzzed with arguments, shouts, and the clang of weapons. The Senate, yielding to pressure and bribery from the Habsburgs, proclaimed Emperor Maximilian as king on December 12th. It seemed all was lost. Jubilation began in the emperor's supporters' camp, but Zamoyski did not give up. He addressed the rank-and-file nobility with a fiery speech. He spoke of honor, of freedom, of the future of the fatherland. He proposed a brilliant political move, to give the election legitimacy and to link the new king with the great dynasty of the past. He proposed electing a king and queen in one person. The queen was to be Anna Jagiellon, the sister of the last king of the Jagiellonian dynasty, Sigismund Augustus. Anna was already over 50, a spinster who had spent her entire life in the shadow of her relatives. But the blood of the Jagiellons flowed in her veins, and for the nobility, this was sacred. And her husband, and therefore the king, was to be Stephen Báthory. The idea was met with enthusiasm. On December 14th, 2 days after Maximilian's election, 100,000-strong crowd of nobles proclaimed Anna Jagiellon as their monarch and Stephen Báthory as king of the Commonwealth. A situation of dual power arose in the country. Two kings, two parties ready to tear each other apart. The fate of the throne was now to be decided not by diplomacy but by speed and determination. And here Báthory showed his brilliance. Unlike the slow and indecisive Maximilian, who remained in Vienna collecting money and troops, Báthory acted with lightning speed. Upon receiving news of his election, he immediately gathered his loyal Transylvanian detachments, and despite the fierce winter, marched at a forced pace into Poland. He understood. Whoever first occupied Krakow and was crowned in Wawel Cathedral would be the real king. His journey was triumphant. The nobility enthusiastically greeted their chosen one. He did not look like a European monarch. Dressed in a Hungarian costume, surrounded by grim, sun-tanned warriors, he resembled the leader of a horde. But there was steel in his eyes and confidence in every gesture. On May 1st, 1576, a double ceremony took place in Krakow. Stephen Báthory married Anna Jagiellon and was crowned king of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He had kept his promise. But the hardest part was yet to come, not to win the crown, but to keep it. And the very first problem was not long in coming. The richest city in the kingdom, the free city of Danzig, flatly refused to recognize his authority. The coronation in Wawel was merely a symbolic act. The real power of Stephen Báthory in the first months of his reign was illusory. Supporters of the Habsburgs, though demoralized by the passivity of their candidate, Maximilian soon died, but his son Rudolf II continued to claim the throne, still held enormous influence. The treasury was empty, the army practically did not exist, and in the north on the Baltic coast, the powerful and fabulously wealthy city of Danzig, now known as Gdansk, openly challenged the new king. To understand the essence of this conflict, one must understand what Danzig was in the 16th century. It was not just a city, it was a state within a state. A member of the powerful Hanseatic League, it controlled virtually all the maritime trade of the Commonwealth. Through its port, Polish grain, timber, and hemp were exported, while European cloths, wine, weapons, and luxury goods were imported. Its architecture, with narrow streets and tall brick houses with stepped gables, was more reminiscent of Amsterdam or Hamburg than Krakow or Warsaw. The city patricians, mostly of German origin and Lutheran by faith, had amassed colossal fortunes. Danzig had backed Maximilian of Habsburg. The citizens feared that a strong King Báthory would curtail their liberties and, most terrifyingly, take control of their revenues. Refusing to recognize Báthory was not just an act of defiance. It was a blow to the very heart of the state's economy and prestige. If Báthory had tolerated this slap in the face, his authority would have been destroyed at the very outset. He could not allow this. Thus began the so-called Danzig War. The king declared the city rebellious, imposed a trade embargo on it, and began to assemble an army. But this was not easy. The nobility, having just elected the king, was not eager to fight Danzig, and more importantly, to pay taxes for this war. Many magnates secretly sympathized with the Danzigers. Báthory had to rely mainly on his Hungarian detachments and mercenaries hired with his own money. In the summer of 1577, the royal army besieged Danzig, but taking the city by storm was practically impossible. Danzig was surrounded by the most powerful bastion fortifications of the time, defended by a numerous and well-armed garrison, and supported from the sea by the Danish fleet, an ally of the citizens. The siege dragged on. Báthory understood that a long and fruitless blockade undermined his position in the country. It was at this moment that he proved himself not only as a commander, but also as an outstanding strategist and pragmatist. He realized he could not defeat Danzig by force alone. He decided to outwit it. Firstly, he established his own fleet near the city, a so-called privateer flotilla. These were small, maneuverable ships that began to hunt Danzig's merchant vessels, undermining its economy. Secondly, he struck at its most vulnerable point. All of Danzig's trade flowed down the Vistula River. Báthory ordered his troops to occupy key points upstream and redirect trade flows to another port loyal to the king, Elbląg. This was an economic noose that tightened with each passing month. Thirdly, he won an important psychological victory. At the Battle of Lake Lubieszów, His small but professional army, consisting of Hungarians, Germans, and Scottish mercenaries, utterly routed the much more numerous army of Danzig, which had attempted to break the blockade. This victory showed everyone that the king's army was not to be trifled with. By the end of 1577, both sides were exhausted. Danzig was suffering from the economic blockade, and Báthory's treasury was empty. Negotiations began, and here the king again demonstrated the wisdom of a statesman. He did not humiliate and ruin the city. He demanded three things: official recognition of his royal title, an apology, and the payment of a huge contribution of 200,000 zlotys to cover war expenses. At the same time, he confirmed all the city's old privileges. The Danzigers agreed. Báthory entered the city in triumph. He did not carry out reprisals. He punished only a few of the most ardent instigators of the rebellion. This victory had immense significance. Báthory had not just subdued a rebellious city. He had shown the entire Commonwealth that a real authority had appeared in the country, one to be reckoned with. He had filled the empty treasury with Danzig gold, and most importantly, he had gained the opportunity to engage in what he considered his main mission. Having secured his rear, he could now turn his gaze to the east, where his old rival in the election, Ivan the Terrible, continued to seize lands in Livonia, threatening the very existence of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. But before starting a great war, it was necessary to create an army capable of winning it. The victory over Danzig gave Stephen Báthory a respite and the means to realize his main goal. He was, above all, a soldier, and understood that the greatness of a state rests on the strength of its army. And the army of the Commonwealth that he inherited was far from perfect. Its main force was the so-called Pospolit-Russeni, the general levy of the nobility. Every nobleman was obliged, upon the king's call, to appear for war mounted and armed. In bygone days, this knightly host had been a formidable force, but by the end of the 16th century it was hopelessly outdated. The nobility was brave but undisciplined. The levy, assembled slowly, did not want to fight for long and simply dispersed to their homes after a campaign. Such an army was unsuitable for waging modern protracted wars, with sieges of fortresses and complex maneuvers. Báthory, who had gone through the harsh school of wars with the Habsburgs and Ottomans, understood this perfectly. He needed a permanent, professional, disciplined army, and he, together with his loyal associate and now Chancellor Jan Zamoyski, began reforms that would forever change warfare in Eastern Europe. His first and main innovation was the creation of the Piechota Wybranieka, or elected infantry. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. From the royal lands where state peasants lived, one infantryman was drafted from every 20 wans, a wan being a unit of land. This peasant was exempted from all duties and taxes, received land for his use, and became a professional soldier. He received standard uniforms of sky blue or gray, for which they were often called blue or gray devils. In peacetime, he lived in his village, farmed, and underwent regular training. In case of war, he had to report for duty with a musket, saber, and axe. This was a true revolution. Báthory created the first mass regular infantry in the history of the Commonwealth, recruited from the local population. These soldiers were hardy, unpretentious, knew the terrain well, and unlike mercenaries, fought for their own land. The elected infantry became the backbone of his new army, indispensable in sieges of fortresses and in field battles. They were armed with arquebuses and long sabers, and their battle axes, or berdes, served as both weapons and tools for building fortifications. The second direction of reform was artillery. Báthory understood that the wars of the new era were wars of cannons. He invited the best engineers and founders from Italy and Germany. With the money received from Danzig, he launched mass production of modern siege artillery. His army was armed with heavy cannons or kartons, capable of breaching fortress walls, and light field guns that could support the infantry with fire directly on the battlefield. He standardized calibers, which significantly simplified ammunition supply. Báthory's artillery park became one of the best in Europe. The third and perhaps most famous element of his war machine was the cavalry. Báthory did not create it from scratch, but he perfected it. It was under him that the heavy shock cavalry, the winged Hussars, reached its zenith. This was the elite of the army, recruited from the richest and most high-born nobility. To be a Hussar was not only honorable but also incredibly expensive. The full equipment, including lamellar armor, a zizak helmet, a leopard or wolf skin, several pistols, a broadsword, and of course a warhorse, cost a fortune. Clad in gleaming armor, armed with long 5-meter lances, sabers, and pistols, they were the living embodiment of the Commonwealth's power. And their famous wings of eagle feathers attached to their backs not only terrified the enemy with their appearance and noise, but also, according to one version, protected the rider from the lassos of Tatar cavalry. The charge of a hussar banner rushing into an attack was practically irresistible. No infantry of that time, including the famous Spanish tercios, could withstand it. But Báthory understood that a war could not be won with heavy cavalry alone. He also actively used light cavalry, the Cossacks. The Zaporozhian Cossacks, free warriors from the Dnieper Rapids, were unsurpassed masters of reconnaissance, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare. Their relations with the crown were always complex. On the one hand, they were indispensable warriors. On the other, their unauthorized raids on Turkish and Tatar lands constantly created diplomatic problems. Báthory officially took them into royal service, creating the so-called register, which marked the beginning of the formation of the registered Cossacks as a separate military estate. He paid them a salary and granted them privileges, trying to direct their untamable energy into channels useful to the state. Finally, Báthory paid enormous attention to engineering and logistics. He understood that for a war with Muscovy, with its vast distances and lack of roads, supply was crucial. His army moved with a huge baggage train carrying provisions, ammunition, and pontoons for bridging rivers. Special engineering units laid roads through forests and swamps, built bridges and fortified camps. All these reforms were aimed at creating a unified, balanced military organism where each branch of the military performed its task. The infantry took fortresses and held the line. The heavy cavalry delivered the decisive blow. The light cavalry harassed the enemy and conducted reconnaissance. The artillery broke through walls and cleared the way. And over all of this stood a single will, the will of the king commander. In addition to military reforms, Báthory also carried out crucial state reforms. The main one was the creation of supreme appellate courts, the Crown Tribunal for Poland and the Lithuanian Tribunal for the Grand Duchy. With this, he transferred the highest judicial power previously held by the king into the hands of the nobility itself, which elected judges from its midst. On the one hand, this strengthened noble self-government. On the other, it freed the king from routine judicial work, allowing him to focus on matters of war and foreign policy. He was also a patron of science and education. In 1579, in the midst of preparations for the war with Muscovy, he transformed the Jesuit college in Vilnius into an academy, giving rise to the famous Vilnius University. He understood that the state needed not only soldiers but also educated officials, lawyers, and diplomats. By 1579, Stephen Báthory had completed his preparations. He had created a new type of army, strengthened his authority, and secured the support of the same, which, seeing the king's successes and fearing Ivan the Terrible's aggression, finally allocated the necessary funds. The moment for revenge had come. The Great War was beginning, which would go down in history as the Polotsk campaign, the first act of the titanic clash of two worlds, two wills, Stephen Báthory and Ivan the Terrible. On the eastern borders of the Commonwealth, clouds were gathering. The Livonian War, started by Ivan the Terrible back in 1558 for access to the Baltic Sea, had turned into a bloody meat grinder, drawing in the Tsardom of Muscovy, Lithuania, Poland, Sweden, and Denmark. By the time of Báthory's accession, Tsar Ivan IV had achieved significant successes. His troops had captured almost all of Livonia, including such important fortresses as Narva, Dorpat, now known as Tartu, and Polotsk. The capture of Polotsk in 1563 was particularly painful for the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. This ancient city, located on the upper reaches of the western Dvina River, was not just a fortress. It was the key to the heart of Lithuania. From here, a direct path to Vilnius was opened. Moreover, Polotsk was an important Orthodox center, and its capture had immense ideological significance for Moscow, which laid claim to all Russian lands that were once part of Kievan Rus. Stephen Báthory understood that without the return of Polotsk, any talk of peace or victory in the Livonian War was meaningless. It was not just a military objective, it was a symbol. The return of Polotsk was to be a demonstration of the new king's strength, proof that the era of humiliation and retreat was over. In the summer of 1579, a huge 40,000-strong army of the Commonwealth gathered near the town of Svir, on the Lithuanian border. It was an unprecedented sight. There were banners of winged hussars glittering in their armor, neat rows of elected infantry in gray uniforms, motley detachments of German, Hungarian, and Scottish mercenaries, and elusive Cossack sotnias. A gigantic siege train moved with the army, dozens of heavy cannons requiring thousands of oxen to transport. The War Council convened before the campaign was full of doubts. Many experienced commanders, including Jan Zamoyski, proposed striking at Pskov or Smolensk, ancient Russian lands, to divert Ivan the Terrible's main forces. But Báthory was adamant. His target was Polotsk. He personally developed the campaign plan, thinking through every detail from the route of march to the organization of supplies. His will was law. The campaign began. The army moved east through dense forests and swampy marshes. It was a most complex logistical undertaking. Thousands of carts creaked along muddy roads. Engineering units laid causeways and built bridges over countless rivers and streams. Cossack cavalry rode ahead, destroying small Russian patrols and gathering intelligence. Báthory applied psychological warfare. He spread rumors that he was marching on Pskov to disorient the Russian command. Ivan the Terrible believed it. He concentrated his main forces near Pskov and Smolensk, leaving Polotsk with a relatively small garrison of 6,000 men. This was the Tsar's first and decisive mistake. On August 11, 1579, Báthory's advanced detachments approached Polotsk. The city was situated on a high bank of the western Dvina and consisted of two parts, the upper castle, a stone citadel, and the lower town, or ostrog, surrounded by a powerful wooden wall with towers. The garrison was determined to defend to the last. The siege began. The Polish-Lithuanian army surrounded the city. The artillery took up positions and began its bombardment. But the wooden walls of the ostrog, filled with earth and stones, proved surprisingly resilient. Cannonballs got stuck in them, causing no serious damage. Then Báthory resorted to a tried and tested method: fire. Special detachments consisting of Hungarian infantrymen, hajduks, masters of siegecraft, under the cover of night and artillery fire, began to hurl red-hot cannonballs, pots with incendiary mixtures, and torches at the walls. The defenders of the fortress resisted desperately. They extinguished fires, threw down scaling ladders, and poured boiling water and tar on the attackers. Several assault attempts were repulsed with heavy losses for the besiegers. Murmuring began in the royal camp. Some commanders again started talking about lifting the siege and retreating. It was at this critical moment that Báthory once again displayed his iron will. He personally appeared at the front lines, encouraging the soldiers and directing the siege works. There is a famous engraving depicting the king, under a hail of enemy bullets and arrows, pointing out targets to his artillerymen. He was not just a monarch, he was a commander, sharing all the hardships of war with his soldiers. Finally, after several days of continuous bombardment and arson, the defense of the Ostrog was broken. Huge sections of the wall were ablaze, and the Hungarian infantry stormed into the lower town. A brutal massacre began. The defenders retreated to the upper castle, the last citadel. Now the full might of Báthory's artillery was concentrated on the stone walls of the castle. After a 2-day bombardment, a breach was made in the wall. A decisive assault was scheduled. But it never happened. Seeing the hopelessness of their situation and not wishing further bloodshed, the garrison of the upper castle, led by its voivodes, capitulated on August 30th, 1579. The capture of Polotsk was a resounding success. Báthory showed mercy to the vanquished. Common soldiers were allowed to leave for the Russian side, while the voivodes were taken prisoner. The local Orthodox population was guaranteed their rights and freedoms. The king entered the reconquered city. The dream of his life was beginning to come true. He had not only reclaimed lost land, he had inflicted a terrible personal insult on Ivan the Terrible. The Tsar was furious. He never did decide to give Báthory a general battle, fearing the power of his new army. The victory at Polotsk had a colossal political and psychological effect. All of Europe began to speak of Stephen Báthory as a great commander, a new defender of the Christian world. His authority in the Commonwealth soared. The Sejm, inspired by the success, unhesitatingly voted for new taxes to continue the war. Báthory had no intention of stopping. Polotsk was only the beginning. His gaze was already fixed further east on the next target, the powerful fortress of Velikiye Luki, the antechamber of Moscow. The triumph at Polotsk did not go to Stephen Báthory's head. He was a realist and understood that one success, however resounding, does not decide the outcome of a war. Even the Terrible was wounded but not broken. He still had vast resources and countless human reserves at his disposal. Therefore, after returning from a winter break, Báthory began preparing a new, even more ambitious campaign. His strategic concept was audacious and profound. He decided not to get bogged down in Livonia besieging minor castles. Instead, he planned to strike at the very heart of the Muscovite state, at its northwestern lands. The target chosen was the fortress of Velikiye Luki. This city, located on the Lovat River, was a crucial strategic hub. It controlled the routes leading to Pskov, Novgorod, and Smolensk. The capture of Velikiye Luki would not only cut off the Russian troops in Livonia from their supplies, but also pose a direct threat to the key centers of the Muscovite Tsardom. It was a dagger thrust aimed at the enemy's ribs. In the summer of 1580, the renewed and reinforced army of the Commonwealth, now numbering over 50,000 men, once again moved east. This time the campaign was prepared even more meticulously. Huge depots of provisions and ammunition were created, and thousands of peasants were mobilized for road work. The army moved in 2 columns, devastating everything in its path to deprive the enemy of resources. On the way to the main objective, Báthory's troops took several smaller fortresses, Velish, Usviati, and Zavolochy. These were local successes, but they boosted morale and secured communication lines. In late August 1580, the Polish-Lithuanian army approached Velikiye Luki. The fortress was completely different from Polotsk. It was not a stone citadel but a wood and earth one, built according to the latest principles of Russian fortification science. A high earthen rampart, reinforced with log structures, was practically invulnerable to contemporary artillery. The garrison, under the command of the experienced voivode Ivan Voykov, was prepared for a long siege. From the very first days, it became clear that there would be no easy victory. Artillery bombardment, as at Polotsk, had no effect. So Báthory once again placed his bet on fire. Hungarian Hajduks, masters of siegecraft under the cover of night, crept up to the walls and managed to set one of the towers on fire. The fire spread quickly through the wooden structures. The besiegers rushed to storm, hoping to break into the fortress through the burnt-out sections. But what happened next became one of the most terrible episodes of the entire war. When the flames reached the powder magazines located in the fortress's cellars, a monstrous explosion occurred. A huge part of the wall, along with defenders and attackers, was blown into the air. The city turned into a roaring inferno. The fire was so intense that, according to eyewitnesses, one could read in the camp at night by its light. Even in this chaos, the defenders of the fortress did not surrender. They continued to fight among the burning ruins, but the forces were unequal. By the morning of September 5th, 1580, it was all over. Velikiye Luki had fallen. Of the once thriving city, only smoking ruins remained. The victory was complete, but it was overshadowed by huge losses and a terrible price. Báthory, surveying the ashes, was grim. He valued discipline and order, and the fall of Velikiye Luki had turned into an uncontrolled slaughter. Nevertheless, the strategic importance of this victory was enormous. The key to the northwestern lands of Muscovy was in the king's hands. Panic seized the Russian garrisons in Livonia. Many of them surrendered without a fight upon hearing of the approach of the Polish-Lithuanian troops. By the end of the 1580 campaign, almost all of Livonia, except for a few towns held by the Swedes, had been cleared of Russian troops. Ivan the Terrible was in despair. For 2 consecutive campaigns, his vaunted voivodes had suffered crushing defeats. Báthory's new army seemed invincible. The Tsar, never known for his restraint, flew into a rage. He began his famous correspondence with Stephen Báthory, a unique exchange of personal, insulting letters in the history of diplomacy. Even feeling his military impotence, tried to humiliate Báthory with words. He wrote, "And you came to our patrimony secretly like a thief without declaring war, and you set fire to our patrimony Velikiye Luki with unquenchable fire. And you shed Christian blood without mercy." He accused Báthory of cruelty, of violating the Christian customs of warfare, calling him a dog and an unbaptized forehead. He reproached him for his low birth, reminding him that he was merely an elected prince of Transylvania. Báthory responded in a no less sharp, but much colder and more sarcastic tone of a European aristocrat. His replies, written in impeccable Latin, were translated and read before the entire army. He retorted, "You reproach me for shedding blood, you, whose hands are elbow-deep in the blood of your own subjects. You who flooded Novgorod and Pskov with blood. Where were you when we took Polotsk? Where were you when we took Velikiye Luki, hiding in your Moscow like a coward?" He issued a personal challenge to the Tsar, proposing to decide the outcome of the war in a nightly duel, one-on-one. Of course, Ivan the Terrible, who was not a warrior, declined the challenge. This correspondence is not just an exchange of insults. It is a clash of 2 worlds, 2 mentalities. On one side, a despotic sacred monarch who considers himself God's anointed. On the other, a pragmatic elected soldier king relying on law and military force. After 2 brilliant victories, Stephen Báthory could have honorably ended the war. He had reclaimed Polotsk, cleared Livonia, and captured an important bridgehead on enemy territory. But he wanted more. He wanted to deal Muscovy such a blow that it would not recover for decades. He wanted to take Pskov, the ancient, rich, and mighty Pskov, which was considered impregnable. This was his most audacious, most risky, and as it turned out, final campaign. The campaign of 1581 was to be the crown of Stephen Báthory's military career. His goal was grandiose, Pskov. This was not just a fortress. It was one of the largest and richest cities of the Muscovite Tsardom, third in importance after Moscow and Novgorod. The walls of Pskov, built over centuries, were considered a masterpiece of fortification art. 5 rings of stone fortifications, dozens of towers, a powerful garrison, and a numerous patriotically minded population made the city practically impregnable. To take Pskov meant to bring Ivan the Terrible to his knees and to dictate any terms of peace. In the summer of 1581, Báthory's 100,000-strong army, the largest the Commonwealth had ever assembled, marched towards Pskov. The mood in the army was victorious. After Polotsk and Velikiye Luki, the soldiers and commanders believed in their king's genius and their own invincibility. In August, the army approached the city and set up its huge camp. The sight was impressive. It seemed as if a whole country had come to the walls of the ancient Russian fortress. But Pskov was ready. The city was defended by a 40,000-strong garrison under the command of one of Ivan the Terrible's best commanders, Prince Ivan Petrovich Shuisky. In addition, the entire male population of the city, about 30,000 people, took up arms. There were enough provisions and gunpowder to withstand a siege of many months. Báthory began to act according to his usual scenario. His artillery took up positions and began a methodical bombardment of the walls. On September 8, 1581, after a powerful artillery preparation that breached the wall in 2 large places, the king gave the order for a general assault. What happened next was a real shock for the Polish-Lithuanian army. The attacking columns, consisting of elite Hungarian, German, and Polish soldiers, rushed into the breaches. They managed to capture 2 towers, the Svinuskaya and the Pokrovskaya. Victory seemed near, but at that moment the defenders of the city showed miracles of bravery. Prince Shuisky himself appeared on the walls, inspiring the warriors. Women and children brought stones, water, and gunpowder. The Russians blew up the Pokrovskaya tower, already occupied by the enemy, burying both their own and the enemy under its rubble. The counterattack of the Pskovites was so fierce and unexpected that Báthory's elite units faltered and retreated in disarray, suffering huge losses. The assault had failed. This was Stephen Báthory's first serious failure of the entire war. His aura of invincibility faded. It became clear that Pskov could not be taken by force. A long, exhausting siege began. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Báthory's huge camp began to turn into a city of mud, disease, and despair. The Russian autumn arrived with its cold rains, followed by an early winter. The soldiers, especially mercenaries from warm countries, suffered from the cold and scurvy. Horses began to die off. Discipline, the iron core of Báthory's army, began to crack. Mercenaries not receiving their pay on time threatened to mutiny. The noble levy, unaccustomed to long positional warfare, openly demanded to be disbanded and sent home. The army, which had so recently seemed invincible, began to disintegrate from within under the walls of the impregnable city. It was at this moment that a new, unexpected figure appeared on the historical stage. It was Antonio Posavino, a Jesuit, a legate, that is, an envoy, of Pope Gregory XIII. This was not just a priest. Posavino was one of the most brilliant minds and most skilled diplomats of his time, a fanatical fighter of the Counter-Reformation, a scholar, and a politician. The Pope was no less concerned about Báthory's successes than Ivan the Terrible was. But for a different reason. He dreamed of a union, the unification of the Catholic and Orthodox churches under his authority. He also hoped to organize a pan-European crusade against the Turks. For this, he needed both the Commonwealth and the Tsardom of Muscovy. The protracted war between them ruined all his plans. Ivan the Terrible, finding himself in a desperate situation, himself turned to the Pope for mediation, vaguely hinting at the possibility of a church union. For the Pope, this was a chance he could not miss. Posavino, an experienced and cunning diplomat, arrived first in Moscow, and then in Báthory's camp near Pskov. His mission was extremely delicate. He had to persuade the victorious king to stop the war and make peace. Báthory was furious. He was one step away from a complete triumph, and now he was being asked to stop. He suspected that Posavino was acting in Moscow's interests, but the situation of his army was critical. Winter was approaching, and Pskov stood unshaken. The Sejm refused to approve new taxes for the war. Continuing the siege threatened a complete catastrophe. Reluctantly, Báthory agreed to negotiations. Negotiations began in December 1581 in the small village of Yam-Zapolsky, not far from Pskov. They were long and painful. Posavino shuttled between the two camps trying to find a compromise. The Russian ambassadors, sensing that Báthory's position was deteriorating, behaved arrogantly and stalled for time. Báthory's ambassadors demanded the cession of all Livonia and a huge indemnity. Finally, on January 15, 1582, after 5 months of besieging Pskov, the Truce of Yam-Zapolsky was signed for a term of 10 years. The terms were as follows. The Commonwealth received all of Livonia, including Polotsk and Velikiye. In return, Stephen Báthory returned to Ivan the Terrible all the fortresses he had captured in ancient Russian territory, including Velikiye Luki, and lifted the siege of Pskov. Formally, this was a victory for Báthory. He had achieved the main goal of the war. He had gained Livonia and secured his eastern borders. The Commonwealth, at the peak of its power, stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. But for the king himself, it was a disappointment. He had not been able to crush the Muscovite Tsardom. Pskov had held out. The heroic defense of the city had saved Russia from complete defeat. Báthory left the walls of Pskov undefeated but not all-powerful. The Great War was over. Ahead of him lay new challenges, this time not on the fields of battle but in the seething cauldron of domestic politics. Returning from the war a victor, Stephen Báthory found himself in a completely new situation. He was a warrior king, accustomed to clear goals and precise orders in a military camp. Now he had to immerse himself in the viscous, convoluted world of the Commonwealth's domestic politics, where the most formidable weapons were not cannons and sabers, but intrigue, laws, and oratory at the same. The main problem he faced was opposition from powerful magnate families. During the war, the nobility, united by a common threat, supported the king. But in peacetime, old contradictions flared up with new force. Many magnates looked with envy and apprehension at the increased authority of Báthory and his closest associate, Chancellor Jan Zamoyski. They feared that the king, intoxicated by military successes, would try to establish an absolute monarchy and put an end to the Golden Liberty. The culmination of this confrontation was the so-called Zaborowski affair. The Zaborowski family was one of the richest and most influential clans in Poland. They owned vast estates and a whole army of their supporters. One of the brothers, Samuel Zaborowski, was a man of untamable temper, a typical turbulent nobleman who recognized no laws. Even before Báthory's reign, he had committed a murder during the Coronation Sejm of Henry of Valois and had been sentenced to exile. However, he did not obey the sentence. served with the Zaporozhian Cossacks, and then returned to Poland, behaving defiantly and threatening the king himself. Báthory tolerated this for a long time, but when it became known that the Zborowskis were preparing a conspiracy against him and Zamoyski, and were conducting secret negotiations with the Habsburgs in Moscow, his patience ran out. By order of the king, carried out by Zamoyski, Samuel Zborowski was arrested and immediately, without a new trial, executed on the basis of the old sentence. The execution of Zborowski shocked the entire Commonwealth. It was unheard of. The king had dared to raise his hand against a representative of a most powerful family. The Zborowski family and their allies accused the king and the chancellor of tyranny and violating noble rights. At the Sejm of 1585, a real storm broke out. Krzysztof Zborowski, the brother of the executed man, made angry speeches demanding a trial for Zamoyski. The country was once again on the brink of civil war, but Báthory and Zamoyski stood firm. They presented the Sejm with irrefutable evidence of the Zborowskis' treason. The king made a speech in which he firmly stated that the law is the same for everyone, for a simple nobleman and for a powerful magnate. The majority of the nobility, tired of the oligarchs' arbitrariness, ultimately supported the king. The Zborowskis were condemned, and their property was confiscated. This was another major victory for Báthory, this time on the political field. He had proved that royal authority in the Commonwealth was not an empty phrase. Having solved internal problems, Báthory began to hatch a new, even more grandiose plan, which was the dream of his life. Having strengthened the state and secured the eastern borders, he now wanted to turn the full might of the Commonwealth, united with Muscovy, against the common enemy, the Ottoman Empire. His goal was not just to stop Turkish expansion. He dreamed of liberating his homeland, Hungary, and expelling the Ottomans from Europe. This was not just a fantasy. Báthory was actively engaged in diplomatic preparations. He sent ambassadors to Rome, Venice, Spain, and even to the Persian Shah, trying to form a broad anti-Turkish coalition. The central element of this plan was to be an alliance with Muscovy, which, after the death of Ivan the Terrible in 1584, had become more compliant. Báthory proposed a perpetual peace to the Russians in exchange for a military alliance, promising them a joint campaign against the Crimea and Astrakhan. For himself, he reserved the main theater of war, the Balkans. It was a plan of truly cyclopean scale. He was conducting secret negotiations with Moscow to conclude a perpetual peace and a military alliance. He planned to reform the Sejm to make decision-making more effective. He dreamed of creating a huge pan-European anti-Turkish league under his command. If this plan had been realized, the history of Europe might have taken a completely different path. But fate decreed otherwise. 10 years of continuous tension, wars, campaigns, and political struggle had undermined even his iron health. In the autumn of 1586, while at his favorite residence in Grodno, where he was preparing for a new Sejm, the king suddenly fell ill. The illness progressed rapidly. The best doctors were powerless. On December 12, 1586, at the age of 53, the great King Stephen Báthory passed away. His death was sudden and gave rise to many rumors. It was said that he had been poisoned by his enemies, either supporters of the Zborowskis or Habsburg agents. However, an autopsy, one of the first in the history of Eastern Europe, conducted by order of Zamoyski, showed that the cause of death was most likely kidney failure. Thus ended a 10-year reign that became one of the brightest pages in the history of the Commonwealth. The man who came to power as a foreigner and an outsider left behind a state that was stronger, more organized, and more authoritative than ever before. But his death opened Pandora's box once again. The country was plunged back into the chaos of an interregnum. Stephen Báthory ruled for only 10 years. In the grand scheme of history, this is but a moment. But in this short time, he managed to do what others would not have accomplished in half a century. What is his legacy? What did he leave behind, and why does his figure still arouse such keen interest and debate? First and foremost, Báthory left behind a strong modern army. The elected infantry he created, the improved cavalry, the powerful artillery. All this became the foundation on which the military might of the Commonwealth rested for almost another century. It was the army built on Báthory's models that would win brilliant victories over the Swedes at Kirchholm and over the Turks at Khotin and Vienna. He taught the noble republic to fight in a new, effective, and professional way. Secondly, he left behind a strengthened state. His judicial reform, the creation of tribunals, streamlined the justice system. His victory over Danzig and the Zamoyski affair showed that the central government could curb separatism and oligarchic conspiracies. He did not break the system of noble democracy, but he made it work, proving that a strong king and golden liberty could not only conflict but also effectively coexist for a common goal. Thirdly, his reign had colossal geopolitical consequences. The victory in the Livonian War long halted the expansion of the Muscovite Tsardom to the west. The Commonwealth firmly established itself on the Baltic, becoming the dominant power in Eastern Europe. Historians still debate, what if Báthory had taken Pskov? Perhaps it would have led to the collapse of the Muscovite state, and the entire subsequent history of Russia would have taken a different path. And what if he had carried out his plan for an anti-Turkish campaign? Perhaps the Balkans would have been liberated a century and a half earlier. These are the great what-ifs that make history so fascinating. But perhaps Báthory's main legacy is the example of a personality in history. His biography is a hymn to will, intelligence, and purposefulness. He was a foreigner, a Hungarian on the Polish throne who at first did not know the language of his subjects. He was not loved, he was not trusted. But with his energy, his victories, and his justice, he earned respect and entered the pantheon of Poland's greatest rulers. He was a man of his cruel age, at times severe, at times merciless. But he was not a tyrant. He was a builder. A surgeon who was not afraid to cause pain to heal the chronic diseases of the state organism. The assessment of his activities, of course, varies. In Polish historiography, he is a national hero, an ideal monarch who saved the country. In Russian historiography, he is a cunning and cruel aggressor who brought much misery to the Russian land. In Hungarian historiography, he is a patriot who, even after becoming king of another country, dreamed of liberating his native Transylvania until the end of his days. But whoever he was, a hero or a conqueror, one thing cannot be denied. Stephen Báthory was a titan, a figure of truly Renaissance scale, a soldier and a diplomat, a legislator and a commander. A man who appeared from nowhere to become for one decade the arbiter of Eastern Europe's fate, and who departed leaving behind a legend of a warrior king whose steel will was able to change the course of history. And the shadow of his stern, aquiline profile still hovers over the towers of Wawel, Polotsk, and the impregnable Pskov, a reminder of those times when the destinies of nations were decided not in offices but on battlefields, to the roar of cannons and the whistle of hussar wings. Thank you for spending this time with us, immersing yourselves in one of the most dramatic eras in history. If you enjoyed this narrative, please subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, and share your thoughts on the great and controversial legacy of Stephen Báthory. Many more exciting stories await us. Until next time.